Keanu Reeves stepped into the dimly lit KFC, the scent of fried chicken blending with the quiet hum of the soda machines. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other exhausted customer grabbing a late-night meal. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few employees cleaning up, a couple chatting near the window, and two little girls sitting alone. Each time someone walked past, they flinched slightly as if expecting something bad to happen. Keanu frowned. It was late, too late for two young children to be sitting alone in a fast food restaurant. Something was wrong, and Keanu Reeves knew it. What happens next will shock you. This is a story of mystery, danger, and an unexpected hero stepping in when no one else would. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The city never truly slept. Keanu felt it every time he wrapped up a long day of filming and wandered the streets of Los Angeles. The crowds thinned, the noise softened, but life never completely disappeared. Cars still hummed in the distance. Neon lights flickered and restaurants closed their doors one by one. But the night still had its own rhythm. He didn't usually eat fast food, but tonight he just wanted something quick, simple, and uncomplicated. That's how, just before midnight, he found himself stepping into a nearly empty KFC. The place was quiet. A couple sat by the window. A lone employee wiped down vegetables absent-mindedly, and the manager counted cash behind the counter. Keanu placed his order, grabbed his drink, and took a seat toward the back. He let out a slow breath, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion settle into his shoulders. But then something caught his attention. There were two children sitting at the front of this table. Two young girls no older than 7. They both wore pink Barbie shirts, slightly worn, and clutched a crumpled piece of paper tightly in their hands. But what stood out the most was the fact that they weren't eating. No fries, no drinks, nothing. They just sat there staring at the door as if they were waiting for someone. A quiet alarm went off in Keanu's mind. He wasn't the type to get involved in strangers' affairs, but something about these girls felt wrong, very wrong. Every time an employee passed near them, the girls seemed to shrink back lightly, as if afraid of being noticed. Keanu observed in silence. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe their parents were in the bathroom. Maybe they had gone to grab something from the car. But as the minutes passed and no one showed up, that uneasy feeling in his chest only grew. He was about to let it go. Who was he to interfere? But then it happened. The younger girl, who couldn't have been older than 6, rubbed her eyes with the sleeve of her pink shirt, and Keanu realized she was crying. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Keanu is about to ignore the situation, but then he sees one of the girls discreetly wiping away a tear with the sleeve of her shirt. Something inside him tells him he can't just leave. Keanu didn't want to scare them. He was well aware of the weight his presence carried. No matter how much he tried to blend in, people often recognized him, but these girls weren't looking at him with curiosity or excitement. They were afraid. He took a slow breath, grabbed his drink, and walked toward their table with calm, measured steps. "Hey there, everything okay?" His voice was soft, friendly. He lowered himself slightly, keeping a safe distance so he wouldn't seem imposing. The girls didn't answer. The older one, around 7 or 8 years old, lowered her gaze and gripped the crumpled paper even tighter. The younger one shrank back, clutching her sister's arm like it was the only thing keeping her safe. Keanu immediately understood they didn't trust him, and from the looks of it, they didn't trust anyone here. Keanu looked around. The KFC remained quiet, but something about the atmosphere felt off. The manager stood at the counter watching the girls, not with surprise as if he had just noticed them, but with a look that said he already knew. In the kitchen, 2 employees whispered among themselves. One of them glanced toward the girls before quickly looking away. They knew something, but for some reason no one was doing anything. Keanu clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to demand answers right then and there. But if there was one thing he knew about scared children, it was that you don't earn their trust by pushing too hard. So he did something simple. He walked back to the counter, ordered an extra soda, and as he passed by the girls' table again, he quietly placed the drink in front of them. No pressure, no words. Then he returned to his own seat for a few seconds. The girls didn't move. The younger one glanced at the cup, then at her sister. The older girl didn't even acknowledge it. Keanu waited, but to his surprise, they didn't touch the drink. Fear. Not of hunger, not of thirst, fear of accepting something. A cold shiver ran down Keanu's spine. He glanced back at the employees. The manager quickly looked away. One of the kitchen workers wiped his hands on his apron, visibly uneasy. What the hell was going on here? Keanu knew he needed answers. He got up and walked over to the counter where a young cashier stood. "Hey, sorry to bother you. I just have a quick question." The cashier seemed nervous before Keanu even spoke. "Those girls over there." Keanu gestured slightly in their direction. "Are they waiting for someone?" The cashier hesitated. His eyes darted toward the manager, who was now watching them closely. Then finally he answered. "They've been here since this morning." Keanu's stomach dropped. "Since this morning," he repeated, disbelief in his voice, "and no one has come for them." The cashier averted his eyes. He didn't want to talk about it, but Keanu already knew something was deeply wrong, and he wasn't leaving until he found out what it was. Keanu decides to ask the cashier if someone is looking after the girls. The employee swallows hard and looks toward the manager before answering. "They've been here since this morning." Keanu returned to his seat, but he couldn't relax anymore. Those girls had been here since the morning alone, waiting for someone who never came. He glanced at them discreetly. The younger one fidgeted slightly, swinging her feet, while the older one kept her eyes locked on the crumpled piece of paper in her hands. What did that note say? And why were they holding onto it so tightly, as if it was the only thing they had? Keanu knew he couldn't force a conversation. They were already too scared, but there was another approach that might work. He decided to give them a choice. He leaned slightly toward them, keeping his voice low and calm. "If you want me to leave, I will." The older girl looked up for the first time. It was quick, just a second, but Keanu saw the conflict inside her. She wanted to say something, but she was afraid. The younger girl clutched her sister's arm even tighter, as if silently saying, "Don't say anything." Silence filled the space between them. Keanu didn't push. He just waited, and then he changed his strategy. If they didn't want to talk, maybe he could ask about something less direct. "Can I ask you something?" The older girl hesitated. "That paper, is it important?" This time her expression shifted. She looked at the note, then at Keanu, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, without saying a word, she slid the paper across the table. Keanu picked it up carefully, as if it were something fragile. The paper was dirty and crumpled, as if it had been folded and held onto for a long time. Some of the words were smudged, but he could still make out the main message. "Wait to KFC, don't leave, I will come for you. Mom." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. These girls weren't lost, they were waiting. But for whom? And why had no one come? He looked up at the older girl, who was now holding her sister's hand. "Your mom told you to stay here." She nodded. "Did she say when she'd be back?" The girl hesitated. She looked at her sister, then at Keanu, and then in a soft whisper she said she'd be back soon. Keanu took a slow breath. Soon, but soon wasn't since the morning. Something was wrong, very wrong. Keanu notices something strange about the note. He asks how long they've been waiting. The older girl replies in a trembling voice, "Since the morning." Keanu felt a heaviness settle in his chest. The girl's mother had told them to wait, but if she had said she'd be back soon, why wasn't she here? Something didn't add up. He scanned their restaurant again. The employees still seemed uneasy, avoiding eye contact with both him and the girls. The manager, who'd been watching earlier, now quickly looked away whenever Keanu met his gaze. They knew something, and Keanu was going to find out what. He stood up from his table and walked calmly to the counter. "Can I ask you something?" he said, keeping his voice low and composed. The cashier, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, swallowed hard as, "Sure, sir." Keanu gestured subtly toward the girls. "Does their mother work here?" The employee hesitated. Then he looked at the manager, as if asking permission to speak. The manager let out a long sigh and gave a small nod. "Yes." The cashier finally admitted, his voice uneasy. "She works in the kitchen, but she didn't come in today." Keanu felt a chill creep up his spine. She missed her entire shift. The young man nodded, avoiding his gaze. "She never misses." "Work," he murmured. But today she just didn't show up. Keanu turned back toward the girls. Their mother hadn't shown up for work. And yet before disappearing, she had left them a note, telling them to stay here. Why, the answer hit him like a weight, and it hurt. Keanu realized the truth. The mother knew something was wrong. She probably didn't know where to go, but the KFC was the only safe place she could think of. It was the only place where her daughters could stay without being forced out onto the streets. And maybe she had left that note hoping that someone would help them if she couldn't come back. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process that thought. Then suddenly a cold sensation ran down his spine. He turned his head toward the window and saw a man standing across the street. The man wasn't moving, he was just watching the restaurant. His hands were tucked in his pockets, a cigarette burning between his lips, his face partially hidden in the shadows. But Keanu could feel it. This wasn't just a random passerby. Was this the stepfather? Was he waiting to see if the girls left the restaurant alone? Keanu took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. But now he knew. This wasn't just a case of a mother running late. Something much darker was behind the story, and he wasn't going anywhere until he knew the truth. Keanu looks out the window and sees a man standing across the street watching the KFC. The stepfather. Keanu's eyes remained fixed on the man across the street. The stranger wasn't moving. He simply stood there, cigarette glowing in the dark, watching the restaurant with an unsettling stillness. Keanu knew that. Look, that kind of patience wasn't normal. This man wasn't just loitering, he was waiting for something. And Keanu had a sickening feeling that he was waiting for the girls. I won't let that happen. Slowly, he turned back toward the girls, the older one still gripped the note, her fingers trembling slightly. The younger one, sensing something was wrong, clung to her sister's arm even tighter. They didn't know it, but they were in danger. Keanu had to do something. He stood up from his seat and walked back to the counter. The manager immediately stiffened. "I need to use your phone," Keanu said. The manager hesitated. "He didn't like this, sir. We can't now." Keanu's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It wasn't a request. The manager exchanged a glance with one of the employees before sighing and nodding toward a phone near the registers. Keanu picked it up, keeping his voice low as he dialed. "Hello, I need to speak with someone about 2 unattended children. They've been left in our restaurant since this morning. Their mother is missing." The dispatcher on the other end responded quickly, asking for details. "Their mother works here but didn't show up for work. No one has come for them. And there's a man outside." His eyes flicked back to the window. The man was still there waiting, watching. "I think they're in danger," the dispatcher said. They'd send someone over, but Keanu could hear it in their voice. They weren't treating this as an emergency. "Please just send someone quickly," he pressed before hanging up. He turned back toward the girls, trying to keep his expression calm. They didn't need more fear. But just as he was about to walk back to them, the restaurant phone rang. A sudden ring made the employees jump. One of the workers hesitated before picking it up. "KFC. How can I?" She froze, her eyes widened, and then she looked straight at Keanu. "It's for you." Keanu's heart dropped. Slowly, he walked over and took their receiver from her, shaking hands. "Hello," a voice came through the line, a woman's voice, shaky and out of breath. Please tell me they're still there." Keanu stiffened. It was their mother on the other end of the line. A frantic woman pleads. "Please tell me they're still there." Keanu gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. The woman's voice on the other end trembled, heavy with fear and desperation. "Please tell me they're still there." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. The urgency in her voice was palpable. A mother's raw terror echoing through the fragile connection. "They're here," he answered. Firmly, "they're safe." A choked sob escaped from the other end of the line. Thank God. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the ragged breathing on the other end. He could hear it in the way she exhaled. She was barely holding herself together. "Are you their mother?" asked softly. A pause. "Yes." Her answer came hesitantly, as if she was afraid to admit it, as if every act of saying it aloud would shatter her already fragile state. "Where are you?" Keanu pressed. Static crackle. Over the line mingled with the sound of hurried footsteps and labored breathing. I'm close, but he's here too. Keanu immediately knew who she meant. Lifting his gaze, he turned his attention back to the restaurant. Window outside, through the faint reflection of dim lighting, he saw the man still standing there. A cigarette burned between his fingers, its ember glowing against the darkened street. His stance was unchanged, rigid, watchful, patient. This wasn't some random loiterer. He was waiting for them. Keanu's stomach churned, his pulse quickened. He couldn't let this man get to the girls. Listen to me, he said, keeping his voice steady. Come through the side door. Now a pause. Okay, then the line went dead. The side door swung open. The woman rushed inside, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her breath coming in short gasps as though she had run the last stretch. Her wild eyes darted across the restaurant, searching, frantic, until they landed on her daughters. She froze. For a split second, her body refused to move, as if her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Then girls. The cry tore from her throat, raw with relief and fear and love, all mixed into one uncontrollable burst of emotion. The two girls turned in unison. The younger one ran first, tiny feet pounding against the floor as she threw herself into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The older one hesitated, just for a moment, as if she needed to be sure it was real. Then she ran too. The mother collapsed to her knees, pulling them in, wrapping them up in her arms. Her body shook with violent sobs. I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered into their hair, her voice breaking apart. The girls clung to her desperately, their tiny hands gripping at her clothing, their bodies trembling as they cried into her chest. Keanu stood back, watching, letting them have this moment, but he knew it wasn't over yet. After what felt like an eternity, the mother finally lifted her head, her eyes brimming with gratitude and exhaustion. She met Keanu's gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying with them." Keanu nodded. "What happened?" he asked, though he already suspected the answers. Swallowed hard then, as if drawn by some invisible force. Her eyes flicked toward the window and she saw him. Her entire body went rigid, her arms tightened around her daughters. He wouldn't let me leave. Keanu's stomach twisted. He already knew, but hearing her say it made it feel more real, more monstrous. Is he their stepfather? Hesked. She nodded, guilt flashing across her face. "I tried to do everything right. I planned to leave before he got home." But her voice cracked. "He locked the door, told me if I left, I'd never see my kids again." Keanu exhaled slowly, trying to control the anger bubbling inside him. "How did you get out?" he asked, his voice low. She trembled, her hands shaking. She brushed a strand of hair from the younger girl's face. "I waited for him to fall asleep and climbed out the window." Keanu studied her, watching the way her fingers clutched at the girls, as if afraid they'd be ripped away from her. Again, she didn't want to go back. She couldn't go back. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked me. Shook her head, eyes glistening with fresh tears. "No." Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and made one final call. "I need emergency assistance for a mother and 2 children in immediate danger." The voice on the other end stood instantly. "We're on our way." Keanu hung up and turned to the mother. "You're leaving tonight?" She blinked, as if unsure she had heard him correctly. "But where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A safe place," Keanu assured her. "He won't find you." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, to say it wasn't possible. "I don't have money. I don't worry about that." Keanu cut her off. "Just trust me." The woman broke down again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was relief. Minutes later, a black car pulled up outside the restaurant. A man someone Keanu trusted stepped out, gave him a nod. "Ready?" he asked the mother, looked at her daughters, then back at Keanu. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Keanu gave her a small smile. "Just take care of them." She exhaled a deep, shaky breath, then climbed into the car, her daughters clinging tightly to her. Keanu watched as the car disappeared into the night, the weight finally lifting from his chest and the minute side. When he realized the girls were gone, he flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushed it under his boot, and vanished into the shadows. Keanu knew this wasn't truly over, but for now they were safe, and that was all that mattered. As the mother and daughters stepped into The car, she reached for Keanu's hand. "You saved us tonight," she whispered they'll never forget. The Keanu squeezed her hand gently, watching as she disappeared into the night, and with that, the story of their escape had ended. But a new chapter of their lives had just begun. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.